History remembers conquerors, kings, and prophets with ease. Their names dominate timelines, their deeds etched into monuments, scripture, and memory. Women, by contrast, are often remembered only in relation to men: wives, daughters, mothers, figures orbiting power rather than embodying it. In much of the ancient world, moral greatness was measured through lineage, territory, or authority, all of which were overwhelmingly male domains. Against this backdrop, the Islamic tradition introduces a declaration that quietly but decisively unsettles history's assumptions. 4 women, drawn from different eras, lands, and circumstances, are named by the Prophet Muhammad as the greatest women of paradise. They are not introduced together by blood, nation, or shared time. They never met. They lived centuries apart. One grew up in seclusion, another in tyranny's palace. One was a merchant of immense wealth, another a daughter who lived and died with little. Their lives unfolded under radically different conditions. Yet, Islamic memory binds them together with a single verdict. Their faith earned them a station beyond comparison. The naming of these women is not incidental. In Islam, paradise, Jannah, is not merely a garden of reward, but a realm of recognition. To be promised a place there, especially by name, is to have one's life declared complete in its moral meaning. It is a judgment not of success by worldly standards, but of endurance, sincerity, and alignment with divine truth. That 4 women are named explicitly, while countless kings and scholars are not, signals something deliberate. Islam does not measure greatness by visibility or power, but by what the human soul chooses when stripped of guarantees. The declaration itself is simple. The Prophet Muhammad speaks of 4 women as the leaders or exemplars among the women of paradise. Maryam, the mother of Jesus. Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh. Khadijah, his own wife. And Fatimah, his daughter. No explanation accompanies the statement. No hierarchy is drawn. No list of virtues is enumerated. The tradition does not linger on why they and not others. It simply preserves their names, inviting reflection rather than closure. To understand why these 4 women stand together, one must first understand what Islam means by moral excellence. Islam does not construct sainthood as perfection without struggle. It does not demand withdrawal from the world, nor does it glorify suffering for its own sake. Instead, it consistently returns to a single question. What does a person do when truth confronts comfort, when faith demands cost, when certainty offers no protection? Each of the 4 women answered that question in a different way. Maryam answered it alone. Asiya answered it in secret. Khadijah answered it publicly and decisively. Fatimah answered it after loss had stripped the world of stability. Their lives form a map of faith across circumstances rather than a single model to imitate. Importantly, none of these women are remembered primarily for rebellion. They did not overturn governments, write laws, or command armies. Their strength is quieter, more unsettling. It lies in refusal rather than domination. Refusal to surrender belief, refusal to barter truth for safety, refusal to abandon moral clarity even when it brings pain. Islam does not romanticize their suffering, but it refuses to ignore it. Their elevation in the hereafter is not compensation for victimhood. It is recognition of agency exercised under constraint. The very diversity of their lives challenges simplistic readings of religious virtue. Maryam had no husband, no wealth, no protector. Asiya had all 3 and rejected their security. Khadijah possessed wealth and autonomy and chose to expend both for a cause not yet proven. Fatimah inherited spiritual authority, yet lived without material comfort or political power. There is no single formula here. no prescribed path that guarantees sanctity. What unites them is not circumstance, but response. This is why the question of superiority among them arises so frequently, and why it is often misunderstood. Readers accustomed to ranking figures by achievement or prominence ask, was one greater than the others? Did one hold a higher station? Islamic tradition resists answering this in the way modern hierarchies demand. Instead, it offers fragmented praise, context-specific excellence, and statements that elevate each woman without diminishing the rest. This ambiguity is not a flaw. It is intentional. It suggests that moral greatness cannot be reduced to a single scale. The same principle explains why other revered women, most notably Aisha, the wife of the Prophet known for her scholarship and influence, are not included among the four. Islam does not deny their virtue. It simply distinguishes between different forms of legacy. Intellectual authority, legal contribution, and public influence are not the same as symbolic sainthood. The four women of paradise are not selected because they taught the most, narrated the most, or ruled the most. They are selected because their lives, taken as wholes, represent archetypal encounters between faith and adversity. Another layer deepens this narrative. Two of these women appear in earlier religious traditions, but not in the same way. Maryam is central to Christian theology, yet Islam reorients her story away from inherited sin and divine incarnation toward personal devotion and moral agency. Asiya, by contrast, is almost invisible in the Bible, where Pharaoh's household is largely portrayed as an instrument of oppression rather than a site of belief. Islam retrieves her from anonymity and places her among the highest ranks of the righteous. Khadijah and Fatimah, meanwhile, belong exclusively to Islamic memory, their stories unfolding not in ancient scripture, but in lived history, preserved through testimony and transmission rather than revelation alone. This interplay between continuity and divergence matters. Islam does not present itself as a rupture from earlier faiths, but as a correction of emphasis. Where earlier traditions sometimes foreground lineage or covenant, Islam repeatedly centers accountability and choice. These four women exemplify that shift. Their worth is not inherited, conferred, or symbolic alone. It is earned through decisions made under pressure. The Prophet's naming of them also functions as a moral rebuke to societies that equate honor with dominance. In naming Maryam, Islam honors chastity without cloister. In naming Asiya, it honors dissent without revolution. In naming Khadijah, it honors wealth used without hoarding. In naming Fatimah, it honors grief born without bitterness. None of these virtues align neatly with political triumph, yet all are elevated above it. To read their stories as isolated biographies is to miss their collective message. Together, they form a theology of resilience. They demonstrate that faith is not proven when it is rewarded, but when it is costly, not when it is inherited, but when it is chosen, not when it is visible, but when it endures unseen. Their lives argue that paradise is not reserved for those who shape history, but for those who refuse to let history shape their conscience. This prologue, then, is not merely an introduction to four lives. It is an invitation to reconsider how greatness is defined. In an age that prizes visibility, Islam preserves figures whose most decisive moments occurred in isolation. In a world that associates power with control, it elevates women whose strength lay in surrender to God, not to circumstance. And in a historical record dominated by men, it names women not as exceptions, but as exemplars. What follows is not a comparison meant to rank them, nor a collection of moral lessons abstracted from their pain. It is an attempt to enter their worlds as they lived them, to understand what faith demanded of each and why, across centuries and cultures, Islam remembers them together. Their stories do not converge in time, but they converge in meaning. Paradise, in Islamic thought, is vast. Yet these four names are spoken together, not by accident and not without purpose. Maryam entered the world already marked by intention. Before she could speak, before she could choose, her life was spoken for in a vow uttered by another. Her mother, long barren and aching for a child, pledged what she carried in her womb to the service of God. It was a vow shaped by hope, devotion, and assumption. Assumption that the child would be male, that sacred service belonged to sons. When the child was born and proved to be a girl, the vow did not dissolve. It transformed. In that moment, the narrative of Maryam's life began with an inversion. What was expected was overturned. What was assumed became uncertain. Her mother named her Maryam and placed her under divine care, acknowledging that the offering was not what she had imagined, yet trusting that God's wisdom exceeded her own. This trust would echo throughout Maryam's life, becoming the defining rhythm of her existence. Maryam grew within sacred space, raised not in the public sphere, but in withdrawal. She was placed under the guardianship of a righteous man, and her childhood unfolded within walls meant for worship rather than family life. While other children learned the cadence of ordinary days, Maryam learned silence. Her world was one of prayer niches, quiet footsteps, and measured hours marked by devotion. This isolation was not punishment. It was preparation. Yet preparation rarely feels gentle to the one being shaped. Her devotion was total, and it unsettled those around her. Sustenance appeared where none should have been. When questioned, Maryam did not claim merit or miracle. She simply attributed what arrived to God's provision, refusing ownership over grace. From the beginning, her piety was marked by a kind of self-effacement. She did not place herself at the center of what was happening to her. She allowed the divine will to remain primary, even when it singled her out. It is tempting to romanticize such a life, to imagine serenity and sacred enclosure. But the narrative resists that temptation. Maryam's devotion did not shield her from fear, it sharpened it. When the moment of divine interruption arrived, it did not come with reassurance alone. It came with shock. She was alone when it happened. Alone, as she had often been. A figure appeared before her, uninvited, unexpected, and terrifying in his suddenness. Her first instinct was not awe, but self-protection. She invoked God's mercy as a shield, asserting boundaries even in the presence of the unseen. This response is telling. Maryam is not portrayed as passive or pliant. She is cautious, alert, and aware of her vulnerability. Faith, in her case, does not erase fear. It coexists with it. When the message was delivered, that she would bear a child without having known a man, her response was not poetic acceptance. It was confusion, grounded in reality. She asked how such a thing could be, not out of defiance, but out of honest bewilderment. The answer she received did not explain mechanics. It affirmed power. The logic of her world was insufficient to contain what was about to unfold. From that moment, Maryam's life moved from seclusion into exposure. Her body became the site of a miracle, and with it, a scandal. In a society where lineage and chastity defined honor, her pregnancy was not merely a personal burden. It was a public accusation waiting to happen. She withdrew again, not into sanctuary this time, but into the margins. Away from people, away from protection, away from explanation. The Quranic narrative lingers on her solitude during pregnancy and childbirth. There is no community gathered around her, no midwife, no family. She labors alone beneath a palm tree, exhausted to the point of despair. In that moment, her faith does not manifest as triumph. It manifests as vulnerability. She wishes, briefly, for erasure, for non-existence, for forgetfulness, for escape from what awaits her. This wish is not condemned. It is recorded. The text does not sanitize her humanity. Relief comes, but it comes without spectacle. A voice reassures her. Provision is placed within reach. She is instructed to rest, to eat, to drink. The miracle of birth is accompanied by the mundane necessities of survival. Divine care does not remove her from physical need. It meets her within it. This balance between the extraordinary and the ordinary defines Maryam's experience. Her return to society is the most harrowing moment of all. Carrying an infant, she walks back into a community that knows her history and expects her disgrace. The accusations come swiftly, framed not only as moral failure but as betrayal of lineage. She does not defend herself with words. She does not argue, explain, or plead. She points to the child. This silence is one of the most striking aspects of her story. Maryam, who has endured isolation, fear, and pain, relinquishes the final defense to God. The child speaks. Her innocence is proclaimed not through testimony, but through revelation. In this moment, Maryam's vindication is complete, but it is not accompanied by apology from those who accused her. The text moves on. Human judgment lingers. Divine judgment concludes. Maryam's life after this moment fades into quietness. The Quran does not chronicle her later years in detail. It does not narrate her death or describe her legacy in social terms. Instead, it preserves her as a symbol of devotion completed, of faith carried through its most vulnerable demands. She is not remembered as a mother who raised a prophet alone, though she did. She is remembered as a servant who surrendered control when control was most desired. When compared to her portrayal in Christian tradition, the differences are instructive. Christianity elevates Mary through theological centrality, linking her purity to doctrines of incarnation and inherited sin. Islam removes these frameworks entirely. Maryam is not a conduit for divinity. She is a moral agent in her own right. Her worth does not depend on what her son represents metaphysically, but on how she herself responds ethically to divine command. In Islam, Maryam is praised not because she bore a miracle, but because she bore its consequences. Her chastity is not a passive state, but an active commitment. Her obedience is not blind submission, but conscious trust amid uncertainty. She is described as chosen, yes, but also as tested. Her elevation comes not from exemption, but from endurance. This is why Maryam stands among the four women of paradise. She represents faith stripped of protection, no husband, no wealth, no social shield. Her greatness lies not in triumph over adversity, but in refusal to abandon devotion when adversity isolates her completely. She shows that faith does not require an audience, nor does it guarantee comfort. It requires resolve. Maryam's story closes not with coronation, but with quiet affirmation. She is remembered not for what she claimed, but for what she carried, physically, socially, spiritually. In a tradition that often measures legacy through action and speech, Maryam's silence speaks with enduring force. She teaches that sometimes the highest form of faith is not assertion, but surrender without collapse. Her life answers one question definitively. What happens when God chooses someone whom society leaves unprotected? The answer is not ease. It is elevation, earned not through resistance to hardship, but through fidelity within it. And yet, Maryam's story, profound as it is, represents only one dimension of the faith that paradise recognizes. Her trial was isolation. Another woman would face something different entirely: power without mercy, truth without safety, belief without acknowledgement. Her name was Asiya. Asiya was born into grandeur. Her cradle rocked not in the humble dwellings of merchants or the quiet walls of sanctuaries, but in a palace where gold glimmered in every corner, where every command bent the world toward her husband's will. She was Pharaoh's wife, a position envied, feared, and absolute. From the moment she could walk, the world she knew was ruled by power, unchecked, unopposed, and often cruel. In that world, obedience was safety, defiance was death. Yet, it was precisely this environment that forged Asiya's singular virtue. Unlike Maryam, whose trial was solitude, Asiya's was proximity to corruption. She dwelt in the shadow of tyranny, a palace suffused with injustice and oppression. Every day, she witnessed human suffering orchestrated by the man she was supposed to call master. Every day she saw cruelty normalized. And yet, she did not surrender. Her faith did not erupt in public rebellion. It blossomed in secret prayer, whispered words of devotion that no servant dared to hear, no courtier dared to echo. In that silence, she built a sanctuary larger than any palace could contain. The pivotal moment of Asiya's story came with a child found floating in the Nile. The infant, small and fragile, was brought before Pharaoh, his life threatened simply by his existence. Many would have turned away, fearful of the consequences of disobedience. Many would have smiled and agreed with Pharaoh's commands, justifying cruelty with convenience. But Asiya acted differently. She did not confront Pharaoh openly. She did not speak defiance with her lips. She intervened quietly, claiming the child as her own in subtle gestures, shielding him from death. While her mind and heart aligned with truth, she understood with clarity that morality sometimes required secrecy as a shield. Her faith, however, demanded more than quiet protection of life. It demanded allegiance to God in the face of mortal danger. Pharaoh was relentless, a ruler whose whims decided death or life. Asiya knew that her belief, if discovered, could bring immediate execution. Yet she did not abandon it. In whispered prayers behind closed doors, she acknowledged the injustice surrounding her. And she asked not for the worldly safety, but for paradise. She petitioned God to build her a home among the righteous, to deliver her from Pharaoh's oppression, and to save her from a world defined by tyranny. This is perhaps her most striking declaration. She prayed for eternal reward, not reprieve in the temporal. She understood that true freedom was not found in gilded corridors or ceremonial obedience, but in the alignment of the soul with God. Asiya's courage was invisible to the public eye. Unlike Maryam, whose trial was exposed and whose vindication became public, Asiya's story unfolded almost entirely in private. Yet Islam preserves her memory with equal, if not greater, weight. The Quran emphasizes her devotion and her moral clarity, presenting her as a paragon of faith despite circumstance. She is a reminder that heroism does not require visibility. It requires consistency and integrity. Her life also challenges modern conceptions of power and virtue. To live among wealth and influence is not always to possess freedom. Asiya had the world at her feet, yet true choice lay elsewhere, in the unseen covenant between herself and God. Her beauty, her comfort, her social standing could not protect her from the moral imperative that defined her existence. In choosing belief over safety, She transformed her role from passive consort to active participant in history, without ever raising a sword or speaking in defiance. There is an extraordinary tension in her story. She lives in the heart of tyranny, yet embodies resistance. She is surrounded by fear, yet is fearless in conscience. She has control over appearances, but surrenders all control over outcomes. Every act of devotion, every whispered prayer, is a rebellion more profound than any political maneuver. And when her faith is finally revealed, it comes at the cost she anticipated. Yet Islam preserves her honor, emphasizing that the risk she assumed was itself an elevation, a measure of her moral courage. Comparatively, the Bible offers only glimpses of women in Pharaoh's household. Pharaoh's daughter rescues Moses, yes, but her narrative stops at compassion for an infant. There is no indication of spiritual awakening, no private confrontation with tyranny, no conscious choice to align her life with divine law at the cost of worldly safety. In Islam, Asiya is not merely a rescuer. She is a believer, a moral agent whose recognition rests on her ethical and spiritual choices rather than her social role. Asiya's story also resonates with universal themes: the courage of conscience, the solitude of belief, and the moral victories hidden from history. She illustrates a form of strength that is quiet but unassailable, a power that is ethical rather than political, a victory measured not in wealth or influence, but in fidelity to principle. She shows that paradise does not favor the visible or the dominant, but those whose hearts remain aligned with truth, regardless of circumstance. Her name and life endure in Islamic tradition as a testament to faith under constraint. Maryam represents faith under isolation. Asiya represents faith under oppression. Together, they form complementary paradigms. One must endure solitude, the other must endure injustice. Both require courage, but the arenas differ. One demonstrates devotion without a world watching. The other demonstrates devotion within a world actively working against her. Both are celebrated equally because both are rare and precious forms of excellence. In Asiya, one sees the extraordinary in the ordinary. A woman living within comfort and luxury, yet entirely subject to moral law, choosing eternal truth over temporal safety. Her life reminds believers that trials are not always external or visible. Sometimes the greatest test is internal, a battle between conscience and convenience, between what is easy and what is right. Her paradise is a recognition of this steadfastness, a reward for a life in which faith triumphed over circumstance even when the world could not perceive it. She prayed silently for God's protection and a home in paradise. And that prayer, in its quiet dignity, became the measure of her immortality. The palace in which she walked faded. Her legacy was no longer bound by stone or gold. The Nile flowed, Pharaoh ruled. Yet centuries later, Asiya's whispered devotion resonates across time, immortalized in spiritual memory rather than worldly history. Her story sets the stage for the next figure, Khadijah, whose trials and triumphs would occur not in isolation or under tyranny, but in the open, amidst society itself. A life in which faith and action were inseparable, and where devotion would shape the very foundation of a new community. Khadijah was unlike any woman in Mecca, not merely because of her wealth or status, but because of the combination of intellect, resolve, and moral integrity that she carried into every aspect of life. Long before she became the Prophet Muhammad's wife, she had established herself as a force in a society where female autonomy was unusual. A society that often measured a woman's worth by lineage, obedience, or marriage. Khadijah measured herself differently, by acumen, virtue, and the capacity to act decisively when circumstances demanded it. She was a merchant of extraordinary skill. Her caravans traveled from the dusty streets of Mecca to the bazaars of Syria and Yemen, transporting goods with precision, trust, and discretion. She negotiated contracts, managed workers, and oversaw her employees with both authority and fairness. Reputation mattered, and Khadijah's was impeccable. Her wealth was not flaunted in ostentation, but leveraged to create opportunities and uphold her principles. Traders, clients, and even rivals recognized her judgment as astute, her word as binding. In this sphere, she exercised power without arrogance, leadership without domination. It was through these business dealings that she encountered Muhammad, then a young man of 25. He was known for his honesty and integrity, qualities that made him stand out among the merchants. She engaged him to manage one of her caravans, entrusting her wealth and her reputation to his care. The successful completion of this journey, coupled with her admiration of his character, set the stage for a relationship built on mutual respect, intellect, and shared values. When the time came for marriage, it was not a simple arrangement of social convenience. It was the convergence of two strong minds, two ethical characters, and two hearts capable of profound commitment. Khadijah's marriage to Muhammad would soon test her in ways that extended far beyond commerce or social standing. When the first revelations arrived, the prophet was shaken, uncertain, and fearful. The experience of receiving divine messages left him terrified, doubting his own sanity. In this pivotal moment, it was Khadijah who became his anchor. She offered comfort, reassurance, and steadfast support. She reminded him of his inherent virtue, his honesty, and his devotion to others, affirming that God would not abandon someone of his character. In her belief in him, she became the first convert to Islam, embracing faith not as a concept, but as a lived reality alongside the Prophet. The challenges that followed were immense. Opposition from Quraysh grew as Muhammad's message threatened entrenched social and religious structures. Economic boycotts, social ostracism, and public hostility sought to destabilize the nascent Muslim community. In every trial, Khadijah's resources, courage, and steadfastness were indispensable. She opened her home, her wealth, and her influence to protect and support the believers. She endured hardship not passively, but with an active, unshakable resolve that exemplified leadership through faith. Khadijah's role was both personal and monumental. As a wife, she offered unwavering support. As a believer, she modeled devotion. As a woman in a patriarchal society, she demonstrated that influence and authority need not compromise virtue. Her generosity was legendary. She gave freely to those in need, distributed wealth without counting, and elevated her employees and friends with trust and encouragement. Her sacrifices were not calculated for reward, yet they laid the foundation for Islam's survival and growth. Her life demonstrates the power of ethical action intertwined with faith. Unlike Maryam or Asiya, Khadijah's trials were not private or hidden. They unfolded publicly in the streets, marketplaces, and homes of Mecca. Her devotion was visible not only through her own choices, but through her tangible support of the Prophet and the emerging Muslim community. Her legacy illustrates a different dimension of sanctity. Faith enacted through social engagement, courage expressed through sustained, observable action, and virtue maintained under scrutiny and opposition. Khadijah's story also highlights a distinction in the nature of recognition. While Maryam and Asiya are revered for enduring hardship in isolation or under tyranny, Khadijah's greatness emerges from the interface between faith and society. she wielded her resources and influence to protect a community, to enable truth to flourish under threat, and to endure trials not alone, but alongside others. This is why she is consistently remembered as the first and foremost woman of Islam, whose moral and practical leadership set a precedent for generations. Her death, occurring a few years before the migration to Medina, marked a profound personal loss for the Prophet. Yet the impact of her life continued to resonate, shaping the ethos of the community and the example of what steadfast faith could accomplish. The absence of a biblical parallel for Khadijah underscores the uniqueness of her story. In Christianity and Judaism, no figure combines wealth, autonomy, moral authority, and intimate partnership with prophetic mission in quite the same way. She is a figure whose presence shaped the course of a community before she even assumed a spiritual title. Khadijah's narrative emphasizes that moral excellence does not exist solely in the realms of contemplation or isolation. It thrives in decision-making under pressure, in ethical action within societal structures, and in the courage to support truth even when it threatens comfort or security. She demonstrates that faith, when combined with practical wisdom, can protect, build, and endure. Her story, preserved in Islamic memory, exemplifies a model of sanctity that is active, engaged, and inseparable from the real world. Through Khadijah, Islam offers a third archetype of female greatness. Faith expressed through agency in society, courage enacted publicly, and devotion demonstrated through both wealth and care. Where Maryam teaches the endurance of solitude and Asiya teaches the courage to believe under oppression, Khadijah teaches that spiritual integrity is not compromised by public engagement or responsibility. Her faith was not quiet. It was practical, visible, and foundational for the growth of an entire community. In this light, Khadijah's legacy continues to inspire. She illustrates that the measure of devotion is not merely endurance under isolation or courage under tyranny, but the consistent alignment of action with principle, even when such alignment risks comfort, wealth, and social acceptance. Her life reminds us that faith, when coupled with wisdom and action, has the power to sustain communities, shape history, and leave an enduring legacy that echoes far beyond personal survival. Khadijah's story leads naturally into the narrative of another woman whose life was intimately connected with the Prophet. Fatimah, the daughter of Muhammad, whose trials and virtues would reveal yet another dimension of faith, one born of love, grief, and moral inheritance. Fatimah's path, like Khadijah's, was defined not by isolation or external oppression, but by the challenges of preserving virtue and devotion in the face of personal and familial loss. Fatimah was born into a world already brimming with tension and uncertainty. The Prophet Muhammad's mission was still in its earliest stages, and opposition to his message was mounting steadily in Mecca. From her earliest years, Fatimah witnessed hostility, fear, and the quiet despair that accompanies persistent injustice. Unlike Maryam, whose challenge was solitude, or Asiya, whose challenge was tyranny, Fatimah's trials were intimately entwined with love and loss, family and legacy. Her faith would be forged in the crucible of grief, perseverance, and moral responsibility, demonstrating yet another dimension of female sanctity in Islam. From childhood, she was closely nurtured by her father and her mother, Khadijah, who had set a precedent of strength, courage, and unwavering faith. Fatimah's upbringing was steeped in devotion, not only to God, but to family and community. Yet devotion, she would learn early, did not shield one from hardship. The societal hostility toward her father, the economic boycott of the Prophet's followers, and the social isolation imposed on their family all shaped her formative years. Fatimah saw firsthand the cost of upholding moral truth in a world that valued power, wealth, and convention above justice. Despite these pressures, Fatimah exhibited an extraordinary combination of resilience, humility, and fortitude. She was not merely a passive observer of events. She actively supported her family and the early Muslim community. Her life was characterized by service and empathy, particularly toward the poor and oppressed. She carried the burdens of others as naturally as she carried her own, demonstrating that faith is not only a private commitment, but a responsibility to act ethically in the world. Her marriage to Ali ibn Abi Talib marked a turning point in her life. Ali, a cousin of the Prophet and a devoted companion, shared her faith, courage, and moral sensibilities. Their union, while deeply personal, also represented the continuation of a spiritual lineage. Fatimah's role as wife and mother was inseparable from her devotion to God and her ethical commitments. She lived with simplicity, rejecting the comforts and privileges that her father's status and her own social position could have afforded her. In this choice, she demonstrated that spiritual inheritance, moral and ethical responsibility, supersedes material inheritance. Yet it was not merely her own asceticism that defined her. Fatimah endured profound personal losses that would test her spirit beyond the ordinary. The deaths of her mother, Khadijah, and later her father, Muhammad, were seismic events, removing her anchors of guidance and comfort. She confronted grief not with despair or bitterness, but with steadfastness. Her prayers, actions, and leadership within her family and community reflected a faith that did not waver even when the world had become unrecognizable. Fatimah's trials also extended into the political and social spheres, where she navigated challenges with wisdom and moral clarity. In the immediate aftermath of her father's passing, she encountered disputes over property, inheritance, and leadership. These were not matters of abstract principle. They were intimate, deeply personal, and fraught with tension. Fatimah approached them with a balance of patience and moral firmness, demonstrating that true leadership and sanctity often require resilience under pressure rather than dominance. Her ethical choices were guided by conscience and a profound sense of justice, reflecting the enduring influence of her upbringing and her own spiritual insight. Her life was intimately connected to the early Islamic community. Yet Fatimah's significance transcends social or political influence. Her virtue was not measured by titles or commands, but by moral integrity, compassion, and spiritual commitment. She embodied the continuity of prophetic guidance, preserving and transmitting ethical and spiritual principles to the next generation. In doing so, she served as a living bridge between the Prophet's mission and the broader community of believers, ensuring that faith was embodied as well as taught. Unlike Maryam or Asiya, whose challenges were primarily external or imposed, Fatimah's trials were deeply personal, entwined with love, loyalty, and grief. Unlike Khadijah, whose trials were largely public, Fatimah's struggle involved preserving moral and spiritual integrity amidst loss and uncertainty. In this, her story highlights a distinct aspect of sanctity: endurance not in isolation or under tyranny, but within the intimate and often hidden trials of familial and communal life. Fatimah's legacy is also unique in that it reflects continuity rather than origin. Whereas Maryam is celebrated for divine selection, and Asiya for ethical courage under oppression, and Khadijah for leadership and early support of prophetic mission, Fatimah's virtue lies in her ability to inherit, preserve, and embody the spiritual and moral ethos of the prophetic household. She exemplifies the faith of a generation raised amidst struggle, tasked with sustaining the moral vision of those who came before. Her reverence in Islamic tradition is profound. Fatimah is called the leader of the women of paradise, an acknowledgement of her unique station, her enduring moral authority, and her role as a model for generations of believers. Her life demonstrates that faith is not static. It is lived and tested in everyday trials, in devotion to family, community, and God, and in moral choices that often go unseen by the world. Fatimah's story completes a spectrum of female virtue exemplified in Islam. Maryam teaches the endurance of isolation. Asiya teaches steadfastness under oppression. Khadijah teaches courage and leadership in public action. And Fatimah teaches devotion sustained through love, loss, and moral inheritance. Each embodies a different dimension of what it means to live faithfully in the face of life's trials. And together, they form a composite ideal that transcends time, geography, and circumstance. Her life leads naturally to reflection. Can any of these women be considered greater than the others? Does one station surpass another? The answer, in Islamic tradition, is nuanced and profound, resisting the simplifications of hierarchy while emphasizing the diversity of paths to moral excellence. The question of greatness is a natural one when reflecting on Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah. Humans instinctively seek to rank, compare, and assign hierarchy. It is part of how societies understand merit. But the Islamic tradition offers a subtler, more profound answer. Greatness is contextual, and the highest forms of virtue manifest differently depending on circumstance. Paradise, in this understanding, does not operate like a human court of comparison. It rewards fidelity, moral courage, and faithfulness, each expressed in its own form. Maryam's greatness lies in her endurance under complete isolation. She bore the weight of divine selection without support, community, or protection. Her faith was tested by solitude, by the fear of societal judgment, and by the vulnerability of pregnancy without a spouse. Her trial was absolute and intimate, her triumph quiet yet eternal. To rank her against others by worldly measures would be meaningless. Her heroism is in the moral integrity maintained without audience or support. Asiya's greatness, by contrast, is defined by courage under tyranny. She lived in the heart of oppression, surrounded by cruelty and absolute power. Her trials were public and perilous, her defiance silent but constant, expressed in private devotion and moral choice, rather than rebellion or proclamation. The danger she faced was immediate and existential. Her station in paradise reflects her refusal to compromise faith for comfort or safety, a form of excellence distinct from Maryam's isolation, but equally profound. Khadijah's virtue operates differently. Her trial was not one of solitude or oppression, but of responsibility and choice. She was a woman of wealth, influence, and power in her society, and she exercised all of these in service of moral and spiritual truth. Her greatness lay in action, in supporting the Prophet, enabling the early Muslim community, and demonstrating courage in the public sphere. She was visible, active, and unafraid to align her resources with faith. Her excellence is practical and relational, a model of leadership and devotion intertwined. Fatimah's path, meanwhile, emphasizes endurance through love and loss. Her trials were intimately personal, intertwined with grief, familial loyalty, and the moral responsibility of preserving her father's legacy. She had no army to command, no wealth to wield, no seclusion to shield her. Instead, she demonstrated courage in emotional and ethical spheres, patience, moral clarity, and fidelity in the face of hardship that touched her deeply. Her excellence is relational, moral, and profoundly human. Viewed collectively, these four women embody distinct, yet equally valid expressions of sanctity. Islamic tradition resists the impulse to rank them precisely because the trials they endured cannot be measured against one another. Maryam's solitude cannot be weighed against Khadijah's public responsibility, nor Asiya's silent resistance against Fatimah's perseverance through grief. Each confronted a different moral landscape, and each responded with a form of fidelity uniquely suited to her circumstances. Their elevation lies not in comparison, but in coherence. Every life reflects a complete integrity between belief and action. Paradise, in this vision, does not reward sameness or visibility, but sincerity, honoring each woman according to the courage she was required to summon and the faith she chose to uphold. The Quran and Hadith underscore this approach by emphasizing virtue in its specific circumstances rather than an abstract hierarchy. Praise is given contextually, often highlighting individual characteristics rather than assigning absolute superiority. This approach reflects a broader principle. Moral excellence cannot be divorced from the situation in which it is expressed. The Prophet Muhammad himself, while naming these four women, does not indicate rank. The absence of such specification is intentional, signaling that paradise is not a linear ladder, but a realm in which excellence is recognized in its own measure. Comparisons, if attempted, are secondary to understanding the diversity of trials and responses represented. This principle also clarifies why other women, such as Aisha, esteemed for her knowledge, leadership, and influence, are not included among the four. Aisha's contributions to Islamic law, narration of hadith, and intellectual guidance were extraordinary. Yet her station reflects scholarly and social authority rather than symbolic archetypal sanctity. The four women of paradise are honored for exemplary faith under trial, expressed in ways that define the moral imagination of believers across centuries. Their stories serve as enduring paradigms of ethical and spiritual excellence, rather than models of political or intellectual achievement. Thus, in Islamic understanding, no one woman is inherently greater than the others. Each represents a unique path to virtue. Maryam through isolation, Asiya through courage under oppression, Khadijah through public action and leadership, and Fatimah through endurance and moral inheritance. Collectively, they embody the multifaceted nature of excellence and the universal principle that faith manifests differently depending on circumstance. The diversity among them also communicates a larger lesson. Human measures of superiority are often inadequate when assessing spiritual merit. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes that God's judgment is based on intention, sincerity, and steadfastness rather than social position, wealth, or public acclaim. In this light, the greatness of these four women is inseparable from the context of their lives. Each faced trials tailored to her circumstances, and each responded with moral clarity, devotion, and courage. Their collective example thus elevates multiple forms of virtue: moral courage in isolation, ethical defiance under oppression, responsible leadership in the public sphere, and fidelity amidst grief and loss. No single path is prescribed. No single model is universally applicable. Instead, believers are invited to understand that excellence is expressed in the forms their own lives demand. In sum, the question of superiority dissolves into a recognition of diversity. The four women of paradise are each supreme in her own sphere. Their lives teach that sanctity is not a contest, but a constellation. Different lights shining in unique ways, illuminating the moral and spiritual landscape. The lesson is profound and enduring. Faith, courage, and moral integrity are expressed differently for every individual, yet all are equally precious in the eyes of God. With this understanding, it becomes possible to approach the question of other revered women, such as Aisha and the mothers of the believers, without conflating forms of influence. Their honor, knowledge, and service are recognized and celebrated. Yet they occupy a distinct sphere of moral and intellectual excellence, rather than the archetypal, symbolic sanctity exemplified by Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah. The reverence afforded to Aisha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad, is profound and multifaceted. Known for her intellect, her memory of the Prophet's sayings, and her role in shaping Islamic jurisprudence, she occupies a unique place in the hearts of believers. Yet, despite her prominence, she is not counted among the 4 women of paradise. Understanding why requires an exploration not of her deficiencies, there are none, but of the distinct nature of the recognition given to Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah. The 4 women of paradise were chosen not primarily for their worldly influence, social authority, or scholarship. They were selected because their lives exemplified faith under trial in its purest, archetypal forms. Maryam represents endurance under absolute isolation. Asiya embodies courage and devotion under tyranny. Khadijah demonstrates moral leadership and commitment in the public sphere. Fatimah teaches steadfastness amidst love, loss, and moral inheritance. Their recognition is symbolic, universal, and enduring. They are paradigms whose lives exemplify the human encounter with God under the most defining circumstances of trial and virtue. Aisha, by contrast, is celebrated for her intellect, her scholarly authority, and her guidance of the Muslim community after the Prophet's death. She narrated thousands of hadiths, provided critical insight into Islamic law, and participated in shaping early jurisprudence. Her contributions are concrete, practical, and essential to the functioning of the community. Yet they belong to a different sphere of virtue. While the 4 women of paradise are elevated primarily for their moral and spiritual archetypes, Aisha's distinction is in knowledge, reasoning, and the preservation of divine guidance. Her legacy is active, instructional, and societal. It does not primarily serve as an archetypal model of endurance under direct personal trial in the manner that defines the 4 women of paradise. It is not a matter of comparison in value, but of type. Aisha's influence is measured by her intellectual and social achievements. She served as a living repository of the Prophet's teachings, clarified matters of law, and exemplified moral authority within the community. She is revered as a guide, teacher, and moral exemplar in practical affairs. The 4 women of paradise, however, are elevated for symbolic sanctity. They embody enduring moral principles in forms that transcend history, culture, and circumstance. Maryam's trial is eternal in its solitude. Asiya's courage is eternal in its risk. Khadijah's public faith is timeless in its application. Fatimah's moral perseverance is universal in its human resonance. Aisha's role, while extraordinary, operates in historical and intellectual space rather than in archetypal spiritual exemplarity. This distinction also clarifies why the other wives of the Prophet are not included among the 4. Their lives reflect devotion, piety, and moral guidance. Yet the Quranic and prophetic tradition singles out 4 women whose virtues exemplify the most universal, timeless forms of faith under trial. These 4 women's stories are archetypal rather than historical alone. They serve as moral and spiritual exemplars, whereas the other wives' contributions, including Aisha's, are remarkable in guidance, teaching, and communal leadership. Moreover, the selection of the four women emphasizes diversity of circumstance and trial. They are drawn from different social, historical, and geographical contexts. Maryam, a secluded figure in a sacred space. Asiya, a believer within tyranny. Khadijah, a wealthy and influential businesswoman. Fatimah, a daughter enduring familial loss. This variety highlights the principle that sanctity can manifest in multiple forms depending on circumstance. Including women whose primary distinction is intellectual achievement or legal authority would shift the emphasis from trial and moral fidelity under extreme conditions to another form of excellence altogether. Aisha's life, therefore, is not diminished by exclusion. On the contrary, it is elevated in a complementary dimension. She demonstrates that female excellence in Islam is not monolithic. It encompasses both archetypal moral exemplars and influential intellectual authorities. Together, these forms of virtue present a comprehensive vision of the possibilities open to women in Islamic history. The heroic endurance of Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah, and the intellectual, legal, and social guidance of Aisha and the other mothers of the believers. The distinction also illustrates an important theological principle. Paradise recognizes moral and spiritual excellence according to type, not merely by comparison. It honors archetypal models whose lives communicate enduring lessons about faith, courage, and integrity. And it honors scholars, leaders, and teachers whose lives preserve, transmit, and interpret divine guidance. Each sphere has its own rewards, recognition, and legacy. While Aisha's contributions shape the trajectory of the Muslim community in concrete ways, the four women of paradise shape the moral imagination of believers across time and space. Islamic tradition emphasizes that these distinctions are not hierarchical in the simplistic sense of better or worse. Rather, they are complementary. The four women of paradise embody the spiritual ideals that every believer can aspire to, regardless of social role, wealth, or status. The other wives of the Prophet, including Aisha, provide practical models for leadership, learning, and ethical engagement within society. Both forms of excellence are necessary, recognized, and celebrated. They are simply expressed through different modes of influence and responsibility. Finally, this distinction sheds light on the purpose of archetypal stories in Islamic teaching. By highlighting Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah, the tradition preserves narratives of courage, faith, and moral clarity that transcend specific historical moments. Their lives serve as moral blueprints, enduring adversity without complaint, maintaining integrity in private and public spheres, supporting truth at personal cost, and sustaining virtue amidst grief and loss. Other women, like Aisha, preserve and transmit knowledge and guidance, ensuring that these moral lessons reach future generations. Both roles are essential to the spiritual and ethical architecture of Islam. In this way, the four women of paradise and Aisha, alongside the other wives of the Prophet, represent a holistic vision of female virtue: the archetypal, the intellectual, the moral, and the societal. Together, they reflect the multifaceted ways in which women can embody faith, courage, and integrity. The stories of the four women of paradise are eternal and symbolic, while the contributions of Aisha are historical, practical, and enduring in communal life. The interplay between these forms of excellence illuminates the richness of Islamic thought regarding gender, virtue, and spiritual recognition, offering lessons that resonate far beyond their immediate historical contexts. The stories of Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah and Fatimah, taken together, form a remarkable constellation of female virtue, each life shining with its own light, yet all illuminating a shared horizon, the profound moral and spiritual ideal recognized by Islam. Their lives span centuries, cultures, and circumstances, yet they are united not by geography or lineage, but by the nature of their faith and the courage with which they lived it. This unity of purpose and diversity of experience is the enduring lesson their stories offer to all generations. Maryam, the mother of Jesus, embodies faith under isolation. She teaches that human strength is not measured by social support or external protection, but by steadfast devotion in solitude. She demonstrates that fear and vulnerability do not preclude greatness, and that moral and spiritual integrity often require enduring trials unseen by the world. Her example reassures believers that even when all appears uncertain or threatening, unwavering commitment to truth and God's will establishes a legacy that transcends life itself. Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, demonstrates faith under tyranny. She lived amidst power, cruelty, and oppression, yet chose moral clarity and divine allegiance over comfort and safety. Her life illustrates the principle that the most profound forms of courage may be quiet and hidden, expressed not in defiance visible to society, but in the fidelity of conscience. Asiya shows that true strength is exercised when no one is watching, and that paradise rewards moral courage undertaken in the most perilous circumstances. Khadijah, the first believer and the Prophet's steadfast wife, represents faith enacted publicly. Her wealth, influence, and social position could have been used for personal gain or comfort, yet she applied them in service of truth, justice, and divine mission. She exemplifies the integration of ethical action and spiritual devotion, demonstrating that leadership, courage, and moral responsibility are inseparable from faith. Her story reassures believers that material resources and social influence, when coupled with righteousness, can transform communities and safeguard the nascent emergence of truth. Fatimah, the daughter of the Prophet, embodies faith amidst love, loss, and moral inheritance. Her trials were deeply personal. The deaths of her parents, the challenges of marriage and motherhood, and the responsibility of preserving the moral and spiritual legacy of her family. Through grief and responsibility, she exemplifies endurance, ethical steadfastness, and the courage to live morally in circumstances where personal loss could easily overwhelm. Fatimah teaches that spiritual greatness is as much about sustaining integrity through suffering as it is about triumph or victory. Together, these four lives form a tapestry of sanctity in which no single thread can claim supremacy over another. Each faced unique trials, yet each responded with unwavering devotion. The Quranic and prophetic traditions emphasize this complementarity, showing that faith manifests in diverse ways and that each response to trial is recognized according to its own measure. The concept of superiority is rendered secondary to the principle of contextual excellence. Greatness in Islam is defined not by comparison, but by fidelity to God in the circumstances in which one is placed. This collective understanding also explains why other revered women, such as Aisha, are honored differently. Aisha's intellect, memory, and guidance were crucial to the survival and flourishing of the early Muslim community. Her contributions are celebrated and indispensable, yet they are of a different nature. The four women of paradise are archetypal. Their lives serve as symbolic models of courage, devotion, and moral integrity that resonate across time and culture. Aisha and other mothers of the believers offer historical, intellectual, and communal models of excellence. demonstrating the multifaceted nature of female virtue in Islam. The stories of these four women also reveal a broader principle of Islamic ethics: that sanctity is expressed in diverse forms, and that moral and spiritual excellence is not limited to a single path. Faith may be expressed in solitude, under oppression, through leadership, or amidst personal loss. Each form is valid, each is honored, and each contributes to the richness of the tradition. Their lives, preserved through scripture, prophetic narration, and historical memory, provide enduring guidance that courage, fidelity, and moral clarity are timeless, transcending the boundaries of gender, culture, and epoch. In addition to teaching about personal virtue, these narratives also offer profound social lessons. They challenge assumptions about power, gender, and influence. Maryam teaches that one's value is not contingent on social recognition. Asiya demonstrates that moral courage can exist even where freedom is absent. Khadijah shows that leadership and action can and should be grounded in ethical principles. Fatimah illustrates that endurance in personal suffering contributes to the moral fabric of a community. Together, these lessons form a holistic vision of faith and virtue that transcends temporal and cultural constraints. The enduring resonance of these women's lives also lies in their accessibility. Each faced struggles that, while historically specific, echo universal human experiences: fear, oppression, responsibility, loss, and the challenge of moral choice. Believers across time and place can see their own trials reflected in these narratives, finding guidance, inspiration, and reassurance in the examples set by these four women. Paradise, in this sense, is not merely a reward, but a moral framework. It honors those who respond to life's trials with courage, integrity, and devotion. Ultimately, Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah form a quartet of exemplars whose stories converge not in time or geography, but in moral and spiritual significance. They show that greatness is multidimensional, expressed differently in isolation, under oppression, in public action, and through the endurance of grief. Their lives collectively define an Islamic vision of female sanctity that is both archetypal and timeless, providing guidance, inspiration, and a moral compass for all believers. In remembering these women, Islam does more than preserve history. It celebrates moral imagination. It elevates those who exemplify courage, faith, and integrity in all circumstances. It teaches that trials are not punishments, but opportunities for virtue to manifest. It emphasizes that faith is lived, not merely professed, and that the recognition of paradise reflects the choices made under the weight of life's challenges. The four women of paradise remain eternally relevant: Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah. Each illuminates a unique path of faith, yet together they demonstrate that moral and spiritual excellence is diverse, profound, and accessible to all who seek it. Their stories endure, guiding generations with lessons of courage, resilience, and devotion that transcend time, culture, and circumstance. In the end, the judgment of paradise is clear. Faith, courage, and integrity, expressed according to one's circumstances, define true greatness. Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah exemplify this truth perfectly. Their lives invite reflection, inspire devotion, and embody the eternal principle that moral and spiritual virtue is measured not by worldly acclaim, but by steadfastness in the face of life's most profound trials. Maryam, Asiya, Khadijah, and Fatimah, four women, four paths, one eternal legacy. Each faced trials uniquely their own, yet all responded with courage, faith, and unwavering devotion. Their stories remind us that true greatness is not measured by wealth, status, or public acclaim, but by steadfastness in the face of life's most profound challenges. If you found their journeys inspiring, take a moment to reflect on the lessons they leave behind. Lessons of patience, integrity, and moral courage that remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that explore the remarkable lives of those who shaped history and faith. And let us know in the comments, which story of the Four Women of Paradise spoke to you the most?